He's one of the funniest men alive, a legend who built an empire out of laughter. But behind Kevin Hart's jokes, behind the fame, the money, and that unstoppable energy, lies a story far darker than anyone could imagine. At 46, something changed. The man who once seemed invincible, who could turn pain into comedy and failure into gold, began facing the one battle he couldn't laugh his way out of, because what started as a story of success slowly turned into one of survival. And as Kevin Hart reaches this new chapter of his life, fans are beginning to realize that the tragedy surrounding him isn't just about what happened years ago, it's about what's happening right now. But before we get there, we need to go back to where it all began, in a small apartment in Philadelphia, where a young boy first learned that laughter could be armor. Before the fame, the millions, and the flashing lights, there was just a skinny kid from North Philadelphia named Kevin Darnell Hart. He grew up in a tiny apartment with his older brother, under the care of a mother who worked tirelessly just to keep food on the table. His father, Henry, was mostly absent, battling addiction, in and out of jail, and often more of a memory than a parent. Kevin would later say that his mom, Nancy, was the backbone, the disciplinarian, and the protector. She kept her sons in line with a firm hand and even firmer faith. She made sure Kevin stayed in school, stayed out of trouble, and stayed focused, even when the world around them wasn't built for that. But still, Philadelphia in the 80s wasn't an easy place for a kid with big dreams. Violence, poverty, and broken families surrounded him. Every day, Kevin saw what could happen when life swallowed people whole, and somewhere deep down, he decided he wouldn't be next. What he didn't realize then was that his weapon, the one thing that would save him, wasn't strength or money, it was humor. Kevin learned to make people laugh before he even understood why. When tension filled the room, he cracked a joke. When his mom was stressed, he'd perform silly skits to make her smile. Laughter became a shield, and in his world, that shield meant survival. He often describes humor as his escape hatch. If he could make people laugh, he could control the room. If he could control the room, maybe he could control his life. And that idea, that laughter could be power, would shape everything that came after. But even in those early days, pain never really left him. While other kids were dreaming of sports or fame, Kevin's dream was simpler: stability, a life that didn't depend on whether his dad showed up or not. He took odd jobs, worked retail, and bounced between small-time gigs, always with one goal in mind: get out. Not just out of his neighborhood, but out of the cycle, out of being another statistic. And it was that hunger, that obsession with proving himself, that gave birth to the Kevin Hart the world would eventually know. Still, the irony is almost painful. The same drive that saved him would later become the very thing that nearly destroyed him. Because when you grow up fighting to survive, it's hard to stop fighting, even when you've already won. And as Kevin's name began to rise on the stand-up circuit, as the lights got brighter and the crowds got louder, the boy who used to hide behind laughter was about to face a new kind of pain, one that no joke could fix. But first, he had to conquer the stage. And that journey from the smallest comedy clubs to the biggest screens in Hollywood would test everything he thought he knew about success, loyalty, and himself. When Kevin finally stepped onto a comedy stage for the first time, he didn't look like someone who would change the game. He was short, soft-spoken, and still carrying the insecurities of a kid who'd spent his whole life trying to prove himself. The club crowd didn't make it easy either. Philadelphia audiences were brutally honest, but Kevin didn't run. He learned. Every laugh, every silence, every failure became another brick in the foundation of a dream he refused to give up on. Through those early years, rejection was constant. He bombed, he got booed, he slept on couches, and performed for crowds that barely looked up from their drinks. But what separated him from everyone else was that he treated every setback like training. He studied his tapes, sharpened his timing, and found his voice, not the voice of a tough guy or a rebel, but the real Kevin Hart, fast-talking, honest, self-deprecating, and fearless. By the early 2000s, that voice started to resonate. Stand-up specials like I'm a Grown Little Man and Seriously Funny turned him from a struggling comic into a household name. People weren't just laughing at the jokes, they were laughing because they saw themselves in him. He joked about family, failure, fear, and finding your way through life when nothing comes easy. And the more personal he got, the bigger the crowds became. Hollywood noticed. Soon, Kevin was appearing in hit movies, hosting award shows, and headlining international tours. The kid from North Philly was now one of the most bankable names in entertainment. He was everywhere, from blockbuster comedies like Ride Along and Central Intelligence to motivational interviews and business ventures. His work ethic became the stuff of legend. He would finish filming at 3 a.m., sleep 2 hours, and catch a flight for a stand-up show that same night. To him, slowing down wasn't an option, not when he'd spent his whole life climbing uphill, but with success came something Kevin hadn't prepared for: pressure. The more famous he became, the more he felt the weight of perfection. Every joke, every movie, every interview was dissected. The internet age amplified every flaw, every rumor, every mistake, and deep down, that old survival instinct, the one that told him he had to keep performing no matter what, started turning against him. He built an empire out of laughter, but empires come with walls, and behind those walls, Kevin began to feel trapped. The man who could make the world laugh suddenly couldn't stop the noise in his own head. The expectations were relentless, from fans, from Hollywood, and most of all from himself. Still, he kept going. Bigger shows, bigger tours, a streaming deal, a fitness brand, a production company. To everyone watching, Kevin Hart looked unstoppable, proof that hard work could beat anything. But in reality, he was running on fumes, trying to outrun something he couldn't even name yet. And then came the moment that would change everything. Not on stage, not in a movie, but on a dark California road in 2019. A single night that would flip his world upside down and force him to confront the one truth he'd been avoiding his entire life, that even the strongest don't stay unbreakable forever. It was September 1st, 2019, the kind of late summer night that felt ordinary, until everything changed in an instant. Kevin Hart was riding in his 1970 Plymouth Barracuda, a restored muscle car that he loved showing off. The road outside Malibu was dark and winding, the kind where a small mistake could become a nightmare. And that's exactly what happened. The car, driven by his friend Jared Black, lost control and crashed through a wooden fence, tumbling down an embankment. In seconds, the roar of the engine turned into twisted metal and silence. Kevin was pulled from the wreckage with severe injuries to his spine, 3 fractures that nearly left him unable to walk. For a man whose life revolved around energy, motion, and performance, that crash wasn't just a physical blow, it was a moment that split his life in two. Before the accident, Kevin Hart was invincible. After it, he was fragile. At first, the public only knew the headlines: Kevin Hart in serious car crash. But what they didn't see was the aftermath, the pain, the fear, and the brutal months that followed. He was rushed to the hospital and underwent emergency back surgery. Doctors inserted multiple fusions along his spine, warning that recovery would be slow, uncertain, and painful. For weeks, he couldn't walk without help. Simple movements sent waves of pain through his body. The same man who once prided himself on being the hardest worker in the room suddenly couldn't even stand without support. And maybe worst of all, he was forced to stop. Kevin had spent his entire life moving forward. The idea of stillness terrified him. But now, he had no choice. During recovery, he said he spent hours alone thinking about what really mattered: his family, his health, his purpose. For the first time, the man who made a living making people laugh had to face himself without the mask of comedy. He later described the crash as God's way of slowing me down. In a way, it was a rebirth, painful, humbling, and terrifying. I was not in control, he said in one interview. I thought I was, but I wasn't. Those words revealed something deeper than regret. They exposed a man realizing that he'd spent years running so fast he'd forgotten what he was running from. The recovery wasn't just physical, it was emotional. He had to rebuild not only his strength, but his identity. Would audiences still see him as unstoppable? Could he still be the guy who turned pain into punchlines when the pain was now real? These questions haunted him as he went through months of therapy, learning how to move, stretch, and eventually walk again. He documented part of his recovery in a Netflix series, Don't Fuck This Up, showing fans a side of him they had never seen, raw, broken, and vulnerable. For many, it was shocking. The man who always seemed larger than life looked small, quiet, almost lost, but that vulnerability made him more human than ever. When Kevin finally stepped back into the public eye, it wasn't the same man who left. He wasn't sprinting anymore. He wasn't trying to be everywhere at once. Instead, there was a new stillness in him, the kind that only comes from being reminded how fragile everything really is. He called it his second chance, but it came with a price. The crash had taken more than his strength. It had shaken his confidence, tested his relationships, and forced him to reevaluate everything he thought success meant. And just when he began piecing himself back together, when it looked like the worst was behind him, life threw him one more curveball, one that wouldn't break his body this time, but something far deeper, because sometimes the hardest battles aren't the ones that happen on the road, they're the ones that happen inside your own home. For years, Kevin Hart had been the golden boy of comedy, untouchable, unstoppable, and seemingly immune to failure. But success can be a dangerous illusion. When you're on top of the world, it's easy to forget how quickly everything can fall apart. And for Kevin, that fall didn't come from Hollywood critics or box office numbers. It came from his own choices. Just 2 years before the car crash, Kevin found himself at the center of a scandal that nearly ended everything he had built. In 2017, a video surfaced online that appeared to show him involved in an affair while married to his wife Eniko. It wasn't just a betrayal, it was public humiliation. To make matters worse, it wasn't just gossip. Someone had tried to blackmail him with the footage, demanding money to keep it private. Kevin refused. Instead, he went public, admitting his mistake in an emotional video where he apologized to his wife and children. But the damage was already done. The world that once cheered for him now watched as his personal life unraveled in real time. His family, his image, his credibility, all were suddenly in question. For Kevin, it wasn't just a scandal, it was shame, broadcast to millions. And in the middle of the storm, he realized something painful. No amount of fame can protect you from your own flaws. He had spent decades building a brand around discipline, loyalty, and hustle, and in one moment, all of that was tested. Behind the scenes, his marriage nearly collapsed. Eniko, who was pregnant at the time, said later that the experience broke her, and that forgiveness wasn't easy. Kevin had to fight for his family, not with money or gifts, but with honesty and time. Slowly, he rebuilt their trust, but the process changed him. Publicly, he doubled down on work. He threw himself into projects, touring, and business ventures, as if staying busy could silence the guilt. But inside, something shifted. That same perfectionism that drove his career now turned inward. He became obsessed with controlling the narrative, with proving he was still the man people believed in. Then came another blow. In 2018, old tweets resurfaced, jokes Kevin had made years earlier, long before he was famous. They were insensitive, offensive, and impossible to defend. The backlash was swift and brutal. Within days, he stepped down as host of the Academy Awards, a dream gig, after refusing to issue another public apology. It was a PR nightmare, but also a personal reckoning. The man who once seemed untouchable was now being reminded, over and over, that every decision, every word, every moment mattered. He wasn't just a comedian anymore, he was a target. Looking back, Kevin has admitted those years were the darkest of his life. Between the scandal, the backlash, and the crash that would soon follow, he was a man at war with himself. And yet somehow, through all of it, he didn't walk away. He once said, "My mistakes don't define me, how I respond to them does." And maybe that's what kept him standing. The same relentless drive that pushed him from the streets of Philly to the heights of Hollywood was now the thing pulling him through the chaos. But surviving scandal and surviving tragedy are two very different things. Because when the lights go down, when the fans go home, and when the headlines fade, the only thing left is you, and whether you can still live with the person in the mirror. And for Kevin Hart, that reflection was about to change again. Not because of fame or failure or even scandal, but because of something far more personal. Something that forced him to rethink, not just his career, but his very sense of identity. After the crash, after the scandals, after years of running full speed towards success, Kevin Hart finally had to stop. And in that silence, he faced a truth he had been avoiding his entire life, that he didn't really know how to just be. Recovery wasn't glamorous. There were no crowds, no laughter, no spotlight, just pain, discipline, and patience, 3 things he thought he'd already mastered. But this was different. This wasn't about pushing through another set at the gym or grinding through another tour. This was about learning to walk again. Literally. For months, Kevin spent hours every day in physical therapy. He had to retrain his body to move, to stretch, to carry its own weight. Each step was an act of defiance, a reminder that he wasn't done yet. But the hardest part wasn't the pain, it was the stillness. For a man who built his identity on motion, being forced to slow down felt like a punishment. He later said, "The hardest thing wasn't the surgery, it was sitting still long enough to figure out who I was without the work." That's when the reflection began. Lying in that hospital bed, surrounded by family and silence, Kevin started thinking about everything he'd taken for granted: his kids, his wife, his health, his purpose. He realized that somewhere along the way, he had stopped living and started performing, even off stage. He was always Kevin Hart, the brand, not Kevin Hart, the man. That realization changed him. When he finally got back on his feet, literally and figuratively, he promised himself one thing, that the next chapter of his life wouldn't just be about success, it would be about significance. He began talking openly about mental health, growth, and accountability, not in the polished tone of a celebrity doing damage control, but as someone who had been to the edge and come back humbled. He admitted that fame had made him arrogant, that his ego had blinded him to the people who truly mattered, and for the first time, he seemed okay with not being the loudest voice in the room. In 2020, as the world slowed down during the pandemic, Kevin found peace in the quiet. He spent more time with his family than he had in years, cooking, playing, laughing, just being present. He also began focusing on his production company, Heartbeat, trying to create opportunities for others, rather than chasing every spotlight for himself. That shift didn't happen overnight. Old habits die hard. He still had moments where the need to control or overwork crept back in, but there was a difference now. He noticed it. He caught himself. Kevin once said in an interview, "I've been broken, physically, mentally, emotionally, but I needed that, because when you break, you can rebuild stronger." And rebuild he did, not into the same unstoppable force he once was, but into something wiser, calmer, and more intentional. He learned that strength isn't about never falling, it's about getting up when you do, and knowing why you want to. But even with this newfound clarity, Kevin's journey wasn't over, because healing doesn't mean the pain disappears. It means you learn to live with it. And just when he started to find balance again, something else began to happen. A quiet fear that time itself might be catching up. At 46, Kevin began realizing that the body he had built like a machine for decades was starting to resist him. The years of performing, training, and pushing had left invisible marks, and when he tried to go full speed again, the consequences came fast and brutal. Because in 2024, Kevin Hart faced yet another wake-up call, one that would remind him that even the strongest comeback can't outrun time forever. For years, Kevin Hart built his life around speed, fast success, fast jokes, fast moves. But in 2024, his body finally made him slow down. It happened during a playful foot race with former NFL player Stevan Ridley. Kevin, always competitive, joked that he still had young man speed. Seconds later, the joke was over. He tore multiple muscles in his lower abdomen and groin, leaving him unable to walk. At first, fans laughed it off. Classic Kevin, turning pain into comedy. But the truth wasn't funny. He was confined to a wheelchair for weeks, in pain that made even standing impossible. The man who once sprinted across stages could barely move. He admitted it bluntly. "I tore my whole lower body. I'm 46 years old. I can't be out here doing this shuck anymore." It was funny, but behind the humor was a sobering reality. Time had caught up. This wasn't just another injury. It was a wake-up call. For decades, Kevin treated exhaustion like a badge of honor. Now his body was saying what his mind never could: slow down. The recovery was long, but this time he didn't hide it. He posted videos from his wheelchair, talked openly about aging, and admitted he wasn't invincible. That honesty resonated with fans. The man who once made them laugh through anything was now teaching them something new: humility. At 46, Kevin began to understand that strength isn't about ignoring limits, it's about respecting them. He started shifting focus, less on non-stop hustle, more on what truly matters: family, purpose, and peace. And while fans might miss the unstoppable Kevin Hart who seemed everywhere at once, what they're seeing now is something far more real: a man still fighting, still creating, but finally on his own terms. At 46, Kevin Hart isn't the same man who once chased fame with reckless energy. The drive is still there, the talent is still sharp, but the meaning behind it has changed. What used to be about conquering every stage is now about understanding which stages truly matter. He said it himself: "You get older, you stop running from things, and start running toward what counts." That line, simple as it sounds, sums up the man he's becoming. The accidents, the scandals, the pressure, all of it stripped him down to the essentials. Now what's left is clarity. He's learned that success means nothing if you don't know who you are when it's quiet. And for the first time in his career, Kevin seems comfortable with the quiet. These days, his focus is on legacy. Not just the kind measured in awards or box office numbers, but in the people he's lifting along the way. Through his company, Heartbeat, he's been creating opportunities for young comedians, writers, and filmmakers who remind him of where he started, hungry, overlooked, and determined. He's also leaned into storytelling that reflects real life, not just comedy. His recent projects, from serious dramas to introspective stand-up specials, show a more grounded version of Kevin Hart, a man who's finally willing to laugh with his pain instead of around it. And behind all that ambition, there's gratitude. Gratitude for his wife Eniko, who stood by him through scandal and recovery. Gratitude for his kids who keep him humble. Gratitude for another chance to live without taking it for granted. But make no mistake, Kevin hasn't gone soft. He's still hustling, still planning, still dreaming. Only now, it's not about being the hardest worker in the room. It's about being the most present one. When he talks about the future, he doesn't mention fame or fortune. He talks about peace, purpose, and impact, about building something that lasts long after the laughter fades. "I want to be remembered for how I made people feel," he said recently. "Not just for how much I made them laugh." That's the shift, from entertainer to example, from performer to teacher. And maybe that's what true growth looks like. Not chasing applause, but learning when to let it fade. Because in the end, the tragedy of Kevin Hart isn't that he fell, it's that it took nearly losing everything for the world to finally see the man behind the jokes, the fighter, the father, the flawed but fearless human being who refuses to let pain define him. And as he steps into this new chapter, one thing is certain: Kevin Hart may be slowing down, but his story is far from over. He's still here, wiser, stronger, and finally, truly alive. Kevin Hart's journey has never been about perfection. It's been about persistence. From the streets of Philadelphia to global fame, from scandal to survival, his story is proof that resilience isn't built in the spotlight. It's built in the dark, when no one's watching. At 46, he's not running from pain anymore. He's learning from it. And maybe that's what makes this chapter so powerful. It's not the end of a career, but the evolution of a man who finally understands what really matters. Kevin Hart's laughter once filled arenas. Now it echoes with meaning. Thank you for watching and celebrating the story behind one of comedy's most determined voices. If you'd like to see more deep dives into the untold lives of today's biggest stars, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned, because every legend has a story worth telling.